Greetings, follower of Christ and or truth seeker. I wanted to record a walkthrough of Matthew chapter 24 with a Preterist interpretation. So this year my church has been going through the book of Matthew, and we're on chapter 24. And also for my birthday this summer I got a commentary, the New International Commentary in the New Testament by R.T. France, top rated on bestcommentaries.com. And it has a preterist understanding, which I find very satisfying, because I can take the figurative parts in the apocalyptic language and take the everyday language as straightforward. So I've been enjoying that interpretation, so I want to walk through chapter 24. Right, so at the beginning of chapter 24, Jesus looks to at the temple, says, "Not one stone will be left on another, everyone will be thrown down." This was a crazy claim to his disciples because the temple looked like really majestic and immovable to them, and they thought it would be a cataclysmic event, even something that would be eschatological in significance. They thought the temple would be around until the end of the age, so they asked him privately, "Tell us, when will this happen, and what will be the sign of your coming and at the end of the age?" So I think these are two different questions that they had closely associated in their minds, but Jesus answers them separately. So when will this happen is, when will the temple be destroyed, and what will be the sign of your coming and of the end of the age, which is the second question, because Jesus would come at the end of the age. And so the word here for coming is parousia. So that's kind of a technical term in the New Testament for presence. It's not a participle, but especially of like an important person's presence. And it only appears 4 times in the Gospels, and all of those are in this chapter. So then Jesus begins answering. He says, "Watch out that no one deceives you. Many will come. You'll hear of wars and rumors of wars. See to it that you're not alarmed. These must happen, but the end is still to come." So despite apocalyptic literature of the time, wars, earthquakes, and rumors of wars are explicitly not signs of the end of the age, or of the signs of the destruction of the temple. These are the beginning of birth pains, so they're the beginning, not the end. Then, moving along in the timeline, you'll be handed over, persecuted, put to death, hated by all nations because of me. Nations, ethnos, could also be Gentiles, so widespread hatred. At that time, so in this time of persecution, many will turn away from the faith, will betray and hate each other, so apostasy, false prophets will deceive many, and will appear and deceive many people. The one who stands firm to the end will be saved. So this word for end, it doesn't have an article in the Greek. Let's see, it's just, what's that, verse 13? So just ace telos. Yeah, no article. So I don't think it's like meaning the same end that Jesus is talking about, or the end that the disciples asked about, but rather just never give up. Never give up your faith. Let's see. This gospel of the kingdom will be preached in the whole world as a testimony to all nations, and then the end will come. So if we look at Colossians, so the word here for the whole world, verse 14, hole te oikomene. So often oikomene in the New Testament means the inhabited world. So in Luke chapter 2, verse 1, I'm just going to pop over here, a decree should be taken of the entire Roman world. So here it's oikomene, same. And also in Acts, Agabus predicts a famine of the entire Roman world. So if we hop over to Colossians 1, Paul could say, let's see, the gospel is bearing fruit and growing throughout the whole world. So it sounds, and this was written probably early 60s AD. So from Paul's perspective, it had been preached in the whole world and was bearing fruit. Also in verse 23, maybe a little bit hyperbolic. But he says, "This is the gospel you've heard and that has been proclaimed to every creature under heaven." And so I don't think that Paul would dispute that this had taken place in the 1st century before the destruction of the temple in 70 AD by the Romans. And then, so that was a precondition, and it was fulfilled, and then the end will come. So I think the end here refers to the end of the temple. So in Greek, that's ta telos here, and then also up here, where he said, but the end is still to come, it's not yet the end. So when you see standing in the holy place the abomination that causes desolation spoken of through the prophet Daniel, let the reader understand, then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. So those other things were not the sign of the end, not the sign of the destruction of the temple, but this is the sign. So in Daniel, the abomination of desolation probably referred to Antiochus Epiphanes destroying, or not destroying, but desecrating the holy place. I think he set up a statue of Zeus and compelled worship. He sacrificed pig's meat on the altar, and even made the rooms of the temple into brothels. And of course, Hanukkah is the celebration of the reconsecration after that defilement of the temple. And in Maccabees, I think 1st Maccabees, it specifically calls what he did the abomination of desolation. So we can interpret that what Jesus is talking about, since it's in the holy place, which would be the temple, some sort of terrible defilement of the temple that would occur while there was still time to get out. So in 66 AD, some zealots went into the temple and killed a bunch of the priests, and bloodshed, according to the law, is a defiling action. And so Christian prophets at that time told the Christians, that's it, get out. And so a lot of them fled to Perea, to the southeast. Let's see, so moving on, let's see, it's very urgent. And it's dreadful in those days. So those days are talking about the days of the siege, or the days of warfare. So especially for pregnant women and nursing mothers who can't just leave their babies behind, they have to bring them. Then there will be great distress unequaled from the beginning of the world until now, and never to be equaled again. So great distress, this is where we get the Great Tribulation. And some people would say, well, the tribulation, the distress in those days were not unequaled. Maybe the Holocaust is even worse. Jesus often speaks in hyperbole, but this is how Josephus, a Jewish historian who witnessed these events, talked about it. That if all of the suffering of all mankind could be added up, it wouldn't compare to what the Jews suffered at that time, something like that, in his Wars of the Jews. Okay, so then he says, if those days had not been cut short, no one would survive, but for the sake of the elect, those days will be shortened. So probably referring to Jewish Christian refugees, but maybe there are some elect who are still in the city, and those days were mercifully cut short. So at that time, so again, during the time of the siege, if anyone says to you, look, here's the Messiah, or there he is, don't believe it. So there were some miracle workers and false messiahs around that time. So France mentions Simon Bar Giora, who was regarded as a king and eventually paraded and executed in the Roman triumph as the enemy's general. And then there were also many false prophets who performed signs and wonders, which some wrongly took to be omens of deliverance, including, according to Josephus, the parting of the Jordan, the collapse of the city walls, the uncovering of Moses' sacred vessels, as well as more generally conspicuous signs and wonders. So these are things that happened in the 1st century. Okay, so then it says, so if anyone tells you, the Messiah is out there, or the Messiah is in here, don't believe it, because, and now Jesus mentions his parousia again, and just like lightning, it's going to be visible wherever you are. You don't need someone to come tell you, hey, here's the Messiah, or there he is, because you can perceive with your own eyes that the Messiah has come at the parousia. And I think that this, wherever there's a carcass, there the vultures will gather. So just like you can discern at a long distance, even without seeing the carcass, you can tell it's there because you see the vultures overhead. So maybe when Jesus comes, we'll see an army of angels circling overhead, something like that. it'll be obvious one way or another. So immediately after the distress of those days, so those days being the siege, the sun will be darkened and the moon will not give its light, the stars will fall from the sky and the heavenly bodies will be shaken. So traditionally this has been taken to refer to the second coming and taken pretty literally. Now scripturally, Jesus is alluding to, it says here, Isaiah 13:10 and 34:4 are the two first references. So I think I have it, yeah, here we go. So Isaiah 13 starts with a prophecy against Babylon. Going down to verse 10, the stars of heaven and their constellations will not show their light, the rising sun will be darkened, and the moon will not give its light. So what Jesus was quoting. Then later it says, Babylon, the jewel of kingdoms, the pride and glory of the Babylonians, will be overthrown by God like Sodom and Gomorrah. So this is something that happened in history. A day of the Lord, not the day of the Lord. So also Isaiah 34:2 says, all the stars in the sky will be dissolved and the heavens rolled up like a scroll, all the starry host will fall like withered leaves from the vine, like shriveled figs from the fig tree. Then the very next verse is judgment on Edom. Edom isn't around anymore, so this can't be like an end time thing. And so it seems to describe also a judgment that happened in history, but with apocalyptic language. It's like we say things like it was an earth-shattering event, which we don't mean like, you look at the earth and it's literally shattered, but it is some sort of great upheaval of worldly systems or structures, something like that. So that's verse 29. Verse 30, then will appear the sign of the Son of Man in heaven. So another way to read the Greek of verse 30 could be, then will appear the sign, sort of the sign of the Son of Man in heaven. So that is the sign that the Son of Man is in heaven. And so where is Jesus in heaven? He's enthroned in heaven at the right hand of God. And so the destruction of Jerusalem would be, in this case, a sign that Jesus is in heaven, he's reigning. They executed him, they rejected him as their king, but God made him king anyway, and so his wrath is being poured out, his prediction is being fulfilled. So also in Matthew 26, 64, Jesus says at his trial, from now on you will see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of the Mighty One and coming on the clouds of heaven. So obviously the people who were alive then didn't live to the second coming. The people he was addressing as you. And from now on, well, what does that mean? And I think it refers to his divine enthronement. Of course, Jesus is, when he talks about the Son of Man and clouds, he's alluding to Daniel 7. So yeah, in my vision at night I looked, and there before me was one like a Son of Man coming with the clouds of heaven. Where is he coming? Is he coming to earth from heaven? It says he approached the Ancient of Days and was led into his presence. He was given authority, glory, and sovereign power. And so he receives a kingdom. So the coming of the Son of Man in the clouds, in the context of Daniel, is not a Son of Man coming to earth in judgment, but a Son of Man coming into God's presence and being enthroned. So I think that that's what Jesus was saying that his accusers would see, that the religious establishment would see. And so from now on, may refer to actually his crucifixion where he is lifted up, as John puts it, but at least his resurrection. So Paul says that he was appointed the Son of God in power by his resurrection from the dead. Well, I mean, wait, isn't he ontologically the Son of God from all eternity? So here, Son of God is a royal title, kind of like Psalm 2, today I have begotten you. And so his resurrection was in appointing him to that position, and showing that in power. Also, it's worth pointing out in Isaiah 19, this is a prophecy against Egypt. See, the Lord rides on a swift cloud and is coming to Egypt. The idols of Egypt tremble before him, and the hearts of the Egyptian melt with fear. So that doesn't mean that like an Egyptian will look up, it's like, what's that fast-moving cloud? Oh, there's someone riding on it. Look, it's Yahweh, and why is my idol shaking? It's trembling with fear. It's not to be taken literally, but God is going to judge Egypt, and it's going to be fearful, fearsome, and their idols can't do anything to stop it. think is what that prophecy is saying. So God on a cloud doesn't always mean like literally God on a cloud. Okay, then also verse 31 is probably the hardest to interpret with a preterist view. But if we're to say it's something that happened in the first century, then it probably refers to God gathering his elect through the supernaturally empowered, including through angelic help, supernaturally empowered evangelism of people from all nations. And so that's something that started. God gathered them together, not in a physical location, but in the church as his new people to replace the old people. Sort of like in the parable of the tenants, it's taken from the unfaithful tenants and given to a people who would produce fruit. And that's the elect. So that's what's happening. Jesus is the new religious leader over God's people, and now the elect are the new people, including from the nation of Israel. Oh, also, all the tribes of the earth, actually NIV has a footnote here, or tribes of the land, which is how it would be rendered in, I think, Zechariah, which it's referring to. Yeah. So anyway, it's not necessarily a universal thing like global, all the people, but it could be all the tribes of the land, because of course the Israelites would mourn when they saw the destruction of the temple, in which they took great pride. Then Jesus says, "Now learn this lesson from the fig tree. As soon as its twigs get tender and its leaves come out, you know that summer is near. Even so, when you see all these things, you know that it is near, right at the door. Truly, I tell you, this generation will certainly not pass away until all these things have happened." So for a futurist interpretation of verses 29 through 30 as the second coming, you have to take some of these figuratively. I don't really like doing that. Or I didn't feel comfortable when I did it in the past. It just didn't seem to fit. So I think that this preterist interpretation makes really good sense out of these. So some people would say, well, all these things doesn't mean all these things, it just means some of these things. Or near, doesn't really mean near, it means in 2,000 years. Or this generation doesn't really mean this generation, it actually means a future generation or a kind of people. So when Jesus uses this generation earlier in Matthew's Gospel, let's see. Let's see if we can highlight generation. Oh, that's a fact book. Generations. What can I compare this generation? They're like children sitting in the marketplace and calling out to others. And then he explains, for John came neither eating and drinking, and they say he has a demon. The Son of Man came eating and drinking, and they say here's a glutton and a drunkard. So this generation, whom Jesus mentions in chapter 11, are the people who had the chance to hear John the Baptist and Jesus himself and responded poorly. So in the context of Matthew, this generation seems to mean literally this generation, exactly what we'd expect, take it very straightforward. Also, when you see all these things, to me that implies that at least some of Jesus' hearers, and he's talking to his disciples, would see all of these things. And so I think a futurist interpretation has to take that as kind of figurative too, like you as like future generations of disciples. So then 36 transitions to answering the second question. So but about is something that Jesus said in chapter 22. So he transitions from talking about marriage at the resurrection to talking about the resurrection of the dead, and he says, but about the resurrection of the dead. So this is a new topic. So now he's talking about that day or hour. So this is singular. And now he's talking about the parousia specifically. So he's making a contrast here. So with the destruction of the temple, it's like a fig tree. Like you can see signs that it's about to happen. You know that it's near, it's right at the door. In contrast, that day or hour of the second coming, no one knows. In fact, it's going to be sudden. It's going to be unexpected. Like a thief, it's going to be business as usual up until the day when it happens. And so the only wise response to what we know and what we don't know about the second coming is constant readiness, which means being actively engaged in the Master's work when he comes and finds us. And especially in be faithful and wise by giving the other servants their food at the proper time. I think this refers to teaching from Scripture. Man does not live on bread alone, but on every word that comes from the mouth of God. So hopefully you at least understand the preterist interpretation. I don't think that it's by any means a first-order doctrine. Actually, I don't think that it changes any major doctrines, how we take this passage, but this was kind of exciting for me to look at it in this way, and I hope it's been edifying for you. God bless.